Welcome to the Cafe Culture Podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
We're here this evening to think about breath, and I suspect everybody in the room is interested in that because we all breathe. But we all have different kinds of experiences of breathing, and I'm going to kind of focus a bit on that. I'm going to think a bit about the ways in which breath and breathlessness are invisible, and I'm going to do that through a series of different sections. So the ways in which breath is invisible to us as breathers, the way it's invisible in social contexts, and the way it's invisible in political context. So I'm going to go through each one of those things. So as Pauline very kindly introduced, I am a clinician, but with a bit of a mixed background. I started out doing history and English, and then I did a philosophy PhD. So it's sort of medical humanities was the kind of natural home for me when I was training in Glasgow initially. And I really came through an interest in medical humanities as an educational endeavour, teaching medical students to be more humane. But then I began to realise that actually in many ways that wasn't really working, actually. So what needed to happen was something a bit more radical. What we needed to do as people working in medical humanities was to assert the importance of the knowledge and the methods that we had in the humanities and in the social sciences for bringing about changes to the evidence base that informs what we do in healthcare. Because that evidence base tends to be informed largely by the biosciences. So that's what took me to the Life for Breath project, that is what it's trying to do, is to engage across the different disciplines, and that includes my colleagues in anthropology, in literature, in history, in clinical medicine, and in clinical science, to try to understand this experience. So I'm really thrilled and honoured to be invited to speak at this event in celebration of PEALS' 20th anniversary. You'll see there's some balloons on your table. It is a birthday, so that seems very appropriate. But also I realised when I was told it was the 20th anniversary that the centre that I set up in Durham when I came to the northeast of England from Glasgow 20 years ago is itself 20 years old in January. So it's a lovely event. So the first thing we're going to do is to look at the balloons. Now, I invite people, if you would like to blow up a balloon. I realise that may be not suitable for everyone here, but do blow up a balloon, and I'll think about the significance in a minute. So I'm going to do it too. And do, tie it up if you'd like to. So, whoa! Somebody's got very powerful breath, I think. That's the thing. So what have we got in this balloon right now? Let's have a think about that. This is what we breathe out. This is containing the air we breathe out. So what's in it? 5% of it only is CO2, carbon dioxide, and that's a kind of surprising thing because that's what we're trying to get rid of when we're breathing out. Around 75% of it is the gas nitrogen, and about 15% is oxygen and water vapor. Now, it also may surprise you to know that there's bits of other things in that air. Methane that comes up from our intestines, for example, and alcohol, if you happen to be imbibing too much at the moment or even last night. And when I was looking at my old physiology book, it said that there's over 250 volatile substances in the human breath. So it's quite a potentially volatile mixture. What do we breathe in? Well, again, mostly nitrogen, 78%, 21% oxygen, so that's what's in the air we breathe. And small amounts of other things. And we know we've heard a lot about those other things recently. There's great concern about air pollutants. Here in Newcastle, the worst recorded place from nitrogen dioxide pollution is Percy Street, closely followed in the northeast here by just where I work in Durham, in Gilesgate. So nitrogen dioxide pollution can trigger asthma and worsen lung conditions, and we know about that, and we've seen that in a number of countries around the world. Delhi in particular recently has been a major problem. And of course, those of us who live here in the northeast are aware that we are steeped in a history of coal mining. This is a miner's lamp actually made out of coal, so I thought it would be an appropriate thing to make. And of course, working in coal mines gives rise to conditions, various conditions that are called the pneumoconioses, which cause fibrosis of the lung. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with that if you've known people who've been involved in mining. It used to be called black lung disease. All these things show one of the reasons why I got interested in doing this Life with Breath project, because of that relationship between the inside of our body and the outside, which is really where the lungs, our breath, it shows one of the greatest sense of relationship between inside and outside of the body. If we were to flatten out the alveoli of our lungs, which is where gas exchange takes place, they would measure 80 to 100 square meters. That's half the size of a tennis court. So quite a large area that is constantly in touch with the outside air. And we take things into the body through that, like medication, soothing medications, inhalations. It was once thought that tobacco smoke was very helpful to people, in fact. And we also take in harmful things like tobacco smoke now, possibly vaping, we're a little bit jury out on that, polluted air, airborne infections like chickenpox and things of that sort. So these ideas and thoughts were what gave rise to the project, The Life of Breath. It's funded by the Wellcome Trust, for whom much thanks, and I share the project with my colleague, Javi Carroll, who's a philosopher at Bristol. And it recognizes that health and illness are influenced by many things, not just the biomedical, but things that happen to us in our lives, and I'll say more about that. So what can a medical humanities project like this do to help? Breathlessness is actually quite a good problem to choose. I shouldn't actually say that because that's boasting, isn't it, really? But anyway, it's a good problem to choose because clinicians are struggling to respond to a quandary. The quandary is that there's discordance or mismatch between how lung function is measured in the clinic and how it's experienced in life. Very often, the two things don't match. That discordance can be up to 60% in the case of asthma, and it also exists in COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And why is that? For this reason. It's not just our bodies that determine our experience of breathlessness, but also our minds. Now, and that includes thoughts, includes emotions, memories, imagination, beliefs, and the context within which we live. Recognizing this doesn't make it that easy to get hold of for lots of different reasons. The cultural historian Steve Connor has written a book about the air, and he opens that book by saying, how does one study an object that is everywhere? To study an object, you have to pick it out from its surroundings and concentrate it in one place. And how do you do that with air, when air is ambience itself? How was the air to be brought before one when it was of necessity and at all times about? Well, this aspect of breath is that it is of necessity and at all times about. It's hidden in plain sight. We take it for granted. It's only when it becomes a problem that it comes to our attention. So if I let the air out of this balloon, or the breath out of this balloon, we can hear it, but we can't see it. Breath is ever present, but it's difficult to describe or capture. We can think of it in this personal sense as something that belongs to us as individuals with bodies, but the implications of that invisibility go deeper and wider than our immediate selves. So I'm going to try and go into some of these things. So we've got the idea of breath as something personal to ourselves, something experienced by ourselves. So I'm going to talk a bit about the physiology and about the experience right now. So, another experiment. Okay, this is called the humming contest. And when we had when we did some work with children on the Celebrate Science Festival in Durham over the last couple of years, we tried this out with the kids and they really enjoyed it. So I'm going to try it out with you. Humming contest. What I want you to do is take a big deep breath. I'll show you, like that. And then what you need to do is just let it out very slowly through a hum, like this. And you need to try and do that for as long as your breath lasts. So, again, health warning, if anyone feels that this is a bit beyond them, please don't try. What I would like you to do is, if you're doing it, stick your hand up when you start, okay? And I'm going to watch when you finish, the hand comes down, and we'll see who's left at the end, okay? Right, are we ready? Big deep breath in, and then Sir, wow. Okay, that's good. It's good. That was 41 seconds. That's pretty good. See, I tell you, the children usually get between 10 and 30. Adults between 20 and 50. 50 is very good. The record is 1 minute, 54 seconds. Ugh, amazing. So you can hold your breath, as we've just demonstrated for a while, but your brainstem will force you to breathe again. So we haven't got complete control of our breathing. It's under both voluntary and involuntary control. Okay. So what does breath feel like to you? I wonder if you've ever thought about what breathing feels like. We're using muscles. We're using the diaphragm, which is the big flat muscle at the top of our abdomen. We use the intercostal muscles between our ribs. Sometimes we use the accessory muscles, the big muscle that connects the base of our skull to our clavicle here. But I wonder if we're aware of the sensations of these bits of our bodies working. I suspect it's not easy to describe it. But I want to read you a little bit from my co-I on the project, Javi Carroll, who's written about what breathlessness feels like. Now, Javi is is an amazing person. She suffers from a condition called lymphangioliomyomatosis, LAM disease. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's quite an unusual condition, but it causes smooth muscle growth within the lungs. And Javi has a quite substantially reduced lung function and has to walk around using oxygen. So this is how she describes the sensation of breathlessness for somebody with a problem like her. Trapped, that's what breathlessness feels like. Trapped in the web of uncertainty, bodily doubt, practical obstacles, and fear. The deepest fear you can think of, the fear of suffocation, of being unable to breathe, the fear of collapsing, desaturated to the point of respiratory failure. Even if illness descends upon you gradually over many years, there comes a point, probably around the 30% of predicted mark, where high spirits and a positive attitude just can't cut it anymore. You're faced with the shrinking of your world, choices, freedom, and eventually your spirit. Many illness narratives take on a kind of dualist flavor. The body fails, but the spirit flourishes. The body is tethered to its failing organs, but the spirit rises free. Not true. our embodiment determines our possibilities and delineates with extreme clarity what one is and is not permitted to do and be. The spirit is tethered to the body, and its limitations cut deep into spiritual life. Transgressions are punished harshly. Push yourself too hard, and you will pay with nausea, with dizziness, passing out, collapsing in front of strangers, or worse, in front of loved ones. Push yourself too hard, and you'll find yourself at the limit, or even beyond what you thought was possible, with saturation dipping below 70% and your brain coming to a standstill. Your being imploding silently, fearfully, while your pants need changing. Perhaps you've never been so breathless. If you are healthy, you probably haven't. So no, it's not like running for the bus. It's not like hiking in high altitudes. It's more what I imagine dying is like. So that's quite a powerful evocation of what the sensation of breathlessness is like. And I think one of the issues that we have when we're trying to think about what that sensation is like comes from the philosopher and Dr. Drew Leder, who talks in his book, The Absent Body, about the fact that we tend to live in modern life rather disembodied lives. Lives when we don't really need to be too aware of our bodies, where people nowadays in the Western world who don't suffer hunger or cold particularly, we have shelter, we increasingly do jobs that don't involve our bodies doing things. So Leder describes three kind of sensory modalities that our bodies engage with. One is exteroception, which is the work of our five senses that we kind of all recognize, sight, smell, all those kind of things. Proprioception, which many of you will be aware of, which is being aware of where your body is in space. The third one, which you might be less aware of, is called interoception. That is the sensation of the workings of our internal body. So that's awareness of things like heartbeat, the gut working, or even the breath. And our sensing of the breath falls into that category. Unless we have a problem with it, or we've just done exercise, we're not usually aware of it. Most of the time, it's in the background. But it's interesting that control of it is essential for the kinds of activities that we have in normal living, such as eating, or doing what I'm doing now, speaking to you. I couldn't speak to you if I couldn't control my breath. Coughing, sneezing, sniffing, all these kinds of things. Or specialist activities like playing a musical instrument, singing, or free diving. So the operations of conscious control over this involuntary as well activity add a great deal of complexity to what is a kind of normal activity for the body. Thoughts and feelings potentially have much more influence in the case of breath. So first-person experience of breath and breathing is deeply implicated with aspects of the invisible. It's the function of hidden organs, only really experienced when we bring it into view by thinking about it or by exercising. Now, I'm going to get you to do some more work because I want you to have an experience, if possible. I've lost my straw. You've got straws on your tables, haven't you? Yeah. Okay, so straws. Oh, it's fallen on the floor. That's fine. Now, what I want you to do here, again, this is about people who can manage this, all right? What I want you to do is take the straw up, put it to your mouth, hold your nose, and we'll start breathing just through the straw, okay? And let's just think about what that feels like. So just have a breathe through it for a bit, and do it and give up when you feel you can't manage it anymore. Well, for those who've given up, how did it feel? How did it feel for you?
Quite difficult.
Very difficult.
To keep it going.
Any other senses? What about yourself?
I could just tell I was going out of breath.
Yeah, tell you could get going out of breath. Did anyone start to feel a bit panicky? No. It makes me feel panicky doing that test. Well, that was just a kind of, to give you a kind of an experience, because it's kind of a bit what it's like to have COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, where your lungs are not able to exchange enough air. COPD, as many of you may know, is a major cause of breathlessness in the UK. It affects 3.5 million of us. And according to the WHO, it's the third most common cause of death in the Western world. Here in the Northeast, we've got 4 out of the UK's hotspots for COPD, according to a British Lung Foundation report. Sunderland, County Durham, South Tyneside and Gateshead. Lungs become stiff, clogged with mucus and also stiff, and I've got a couple of sponges here. So this is what a normal lung should kind of feel like. It should spring back into your hand, but this one is more like what you get in COPD, if you want to pass those around. The lungs get stiff, they can't exchange air. And we've heard, and the other thing that happens actually is air gets trapped in those hard bits of lung, and the lung becomes hyper-extended. So on the X-ray, you see very black-looking lungs because of that, and the lungs just can't actually move in and out. So you just get air trapped within them, and you can't exchange it. We've heard Javi's description of breathlessness from our own experience, but medicine sometimes gives rather different description, trying to capture things from the third-person perspective. So we get 3 in medicine, in the descriptions we give in medicine, we get 3 different sensations. We get the wheeze of asthma, the tightness. Some of you, imagine if you suffer from asthma, you get this tightness and wheeze. You can hear wheeze in the breath. You get this thing called air hunger, which I think we experienced a little bit just breathing through that. So that's when there's a sense of there not being enough oxygen in the air that you're breathing. And then there's this thing called the work or effort of breathing, which you get in COPD when the lungs are stiff and there's a sense you have to work quite hard. So one of the problems with those descriptions is that they often don't necessarily connect with the ways in which people with breathlessness actually think about their breathing. And some of the research we've done using some of these descriptions, we've asked people to explain, well, does that mean anything to you? How do you make sense of that? And people very often find it quite difficult to reconcile these clinical terminologies with their own experience. So I'm going to start to move into that that external perception and the social world. And what's it like for people with breathlessness? How do others around them react? Because breathing is a social phenomenon. We, in a sense, we all breathe each other's air. We were reading some very interesting research, and some of this research came out of an interest in smoking. And one of the things that interested me about smoking is the way in which the visible smoke showed how far our bodies projected into the external space. And there's some marvelous research by an Australian anthropologist whose name's Simone Dennis, and she wrote about a woman, Megan, who uses her smoke to flirt. So blowing her smoke up the side of a man's ear if she's interested in him. And that's one quite good way of going about it. So you can take up vaping, but I don't. She says, if I'm interested in a man, I like to blow my smoke up around the side of his face like a caress. Rather nice, isn't it? You can understand why people like smoking. So interactions in that social space are undertaken consciously and unconsciously by activities that depend on breath, as I before, like speaking, like sighing, like gasping, like other expressions of emotion. So when we've actually talked to people who suffer from breathlessness, and we've worked a lot with people from British Lung Foundation Breathe Easy groups around the Northeast, they make lots of arrangements to try to avoid these social interactions. One said, surprisingly, she doesn't accept lifts to social events because if she goes under her own steam, she can get there early enough to recover her breath to be able to start to interact with people. And it's common for people with breathlessness to avoid walking along the street with somebody else because you can't walk and talk at the same time. It's very difficult to do that. Others have reported the tactic of pausing to pretend to look in a shop window or to look at their mobile phone to recover breath. Another group member said, somebody said to her, oh, you're looking really well. And she's actually had to respond, well, I'm awaiting a lung transplant. And another, which I thought was very difficult, was parking up in a disabled parking space and got out the car and got abused by people because he didn't apparently have a disability. And it was only when he started to walk that the problem became apparent. So people with breathlessness have a really paradoxical attitude towards this invisibility. On the one hand, there's a desire to ensure that they appear normal and are able to function in these social spaces. On the other hand, a kind of resentment that maybe they're not noticed. Even GPs are unaware of the extent of the problem. People will get to see their GPs early enough so that they recover their breath sufficiently to be able to interact in that consultation. And some of our colleagues in the Breathe Easy groups have said that they've been turned down for this personal independence payment because they've arrived at the examination centre in good time to recover their breath, and then it looks like there's nothing wrong with them. So appearing normal is important, but it can lead to problems. So this takes me nicely, I think, into the political. There's lots of problems with breathlessness in terms of stigma. People with breathlessness feel stigmatized, feel ashamed of it, because it's seen as self-inflicted, particularly in relation to smoking, but also as it's often people who are getting older that are affected by it, and there's a sense that people are not looking after themselves, not keeping fit. It's seen as shameful and embarrassing. And in the film we made for our exhibition that we had in Durham last year that went on to the Royal College of Physicians in London, our Breathe Easy colleagues comment, it's not very glam when you sound like a set of bagpipes. The sound of difficult breathing is not easy to listen to. And as well as that, there's cultural associations with it. I was going to play you some breath sounds at this point, but I'm just wondering, what does noisy, loud breathing make you think of? Any suggestions? Sex is one. That's quite a nice thing, though. Anything else? Somebody coming up behind you on a dark night, or speaking or breathing down the phone. This is a trope in cinema. I was going to play you Darth Vader's breathing, okay? And there's a scholar who's written about breath in cinema, one of the few bits of cultural history of breathing. And she says, she talks about Darth Vader's breathing as being fearful and scary, and says breathing elicits feelings of unease that may haunt the viewer long after the film has ended. Heavy breathing is associated with fear, and no wonder breathless people want to hide away. The other issue about breathlessness is that it has a tendency to affect people who live in areas of disadvantage. I live in Durham. I don't know very many people who suffer from COPD in my middle-class milieu. But if you move to one of the outside villages, just outside the city, one of the outside mining villages, there'll be a lot of people who suffer from COPD there. I used to work as a GP before I came into academia, and I worked in a particularly tough area, the old shipyard building areas of Glasgow. And I just expected all my middle-aged and older people to have a cough and a spit and difficulty with their breathing in the wintertime. It was just normal for Yoker and Clydebank. That was just the way it was. And so one didn't tend to respond to it or do very much about it, to my shame. So people living in these disadvantaged areas see it as part of what normal life is like there. It's just their lot. And some of our research has suggested that people don't actually feel worthy of having it noticed or done anything about. And as a result of that, perhaps, research funding and support for this problem is very poor. If in other contexts you had a mental health or a disability that was being ignored or subject to stigma, there might be a very strong patient activist movement would rise up for better awareness, better research funding. This population, older population, they're not very well, they don't feel deserving. And it's as much as they can do to get out and do the shopping. This problem doesn't tend to attract people who are champions. Heart disease does. High-profile people such as Tony Blair and Bill Clinton have heart disease, but not COPD. It's not a problem that afflicts people in the public eye, and that has consequences. 7 million people in the UK have heart disease. Funding from the British Heart Foundation alone is 120 million. 12 million people in the UK suffer from respiratory disease. Research funding from all sources is only 96 million. So it has consequences, and it's one of the reasons why there's not a lot being done. So what are we doing? Breathlessness is a poor relation. What are we doing as a project to try to address this? Well, one of the things that we've done is we have got our resources together to explore the cultural context within which breath and breathlessness are understood. So we're having a book that's coming out next year that's tracking this understanding of breath from the Greek period to the present day through culture. And that's important because it's really one of the things that I noticed through doing our research is that people lack language to express what it is they're feeling and experiencing. And we've done work with, through our time with colleagues in Breathe Easy groups, as I've said, in Durham, and there's one in Durham, in Derwent side, that we did a writer's residency with. And the people in the Breathe Easy group got writing poetry. And I want to read you one from one of our colleagues in that Breathe Easy group. Her name's Jill Gladstone. She's the chair of the Breathe Easy group. And this is what she says in her poem. It's called A Chance. Grasp with gratitude this chance to speak. To say what? Can I do it? Can we do it? Do we have the courage? Do we have the language? We have the thoughts, mostly hidden, but words denied, or rather not asked for, over the millennia. Thoughts fly, words flood. Whose language do we use? Who can share? So I was very struck by Jill's poem because it really showed me that we were offering an opportunity with this writer to enable people to try to express their experience in ways that they'd never been invited to before. The only way in which their breathlessness had been revealed to them through words was through clinical language that didn't always align. We've also worked with visual artists, especially the artist Jane Wilton, and please take away one of the postcards on your table. Jane has spent most of her career trying to visualize the breath, and this is one of the images that she's produced, and she did a workshop with us, and at that we produced some images of this is my breath on a copper plate. So I'll pass these around as well, actually, because we managed to capture breath on the page, which is not an easy thing to do, but Jane really knows what she's doing, and one of the consequences of this for a patient that Jane worked with was actually, although she found some of the images a bit strange, at least they showed I did have breath. So that was quite useful. So we've done work, we've held an exhibition in Durham and in Bristol and in the Royal College of Physicians in London, and we've worked with BLF Breathe Easy groups to push for more visibility with the problem of breathlessness. We also organised a meeting in the Houses of Parliament to push for more visibility for this with the all-party parliamentary group on breathlessness, but sadly that's been thwarted by the election. But most of all, as I said at the beginning, research collaborations, particularly with neuroscientists, has helped us to try to uncover some of the underlying ideas that influence people's breath. And we've got this sense that there's a complex set of understanding that drive how people experience their breath. Their thoughts, emotions, memory, cultural context, space, spirituality, belief, all influence this experience. And what we're now finding out is what we've now found out from all of these different sources, looking at language, looking at this interaction with neuroscience, is that we've started to apply it to one of the major problems that we have in managing chronic breathlessness, which is that people tend not to take up the main management modality, which is pulmonary rehabilitation. Pulmonary rehabilitation is offered to people with chronic breathlessness. It's carried out, it's kind of gym-like activities that are carried out in a gym-like space. And even if people start doing the pulmonary rehabilitation, only 40 out of 100 who start it will finish it. And why is this? Well, what we found out is that people are not so keen on the gym-like activities. This demographic of older people are not people who are used to going to the gym, and it's alien, and they don't like to be breathless. The language used in these contexts is that of work, effort, getting at outcomes, attaining a goal. And people are not necessarily encouraged to engage their whole body and improve their interoceptive awareness. So we've got a hypothesis. We thought, well, okay, let's try dance, because that's got some advantages. It provides activity in what might be a culturally familiar space. This idea was brought to us by a colleague who's done some work in London. Her name is Shan Williams. She's a dancer, and she's done some work with the Breathe Easy group in Haringey. And what Shan always says is, these people were the swingers of their day. They're the people that were propping up the bar in the dance clubs in London in the 50s and the 60s. And of course, that meant smoking. And now they've all got COPD or some other kind of lung disease, and they're finding it difficult. But the dance is in their souls, and they want to do it, and they feel good doing it. The language is not of work or effort, but of fun, movement, engagement with others. And in terms of the neuroscience, interoceptive awareness tends to be reduced in people with chronic illness, particularly breathlessness, partly because they're not engaging their bodies, this disembodiedness that we have, partly because of intercurrent things like anxiety and depression, which often go with it. So re-engaging people with their bodies is important, and re-engaging them in an activity which makes them feel good or makes their bodies feel good for the first time seems to me to be a really interesting idea. So we've had a pilot running with the Breathe Easy group in Darlington since the summer. It's still going on till Christmas time. But the initial findings suggest people have had improvements in strength and mobility. This is some of the measurements our physiotherapy collaborators have been doing. People feel motivated by dancing with others. It's fun. They don't realize they're exercising. And having fun together has deepened the bonds of this group, and they've done more socializing together. The jury's a bit out still on the interoceptive awareness, partly because the tool we have is maybe not that good, but that's something we're going to explore a bit further. And we're now trying to find other ways of continuing this problem with the group beyond the time of the project. So for me, just to wrap up, this project has taught me a great deal, but it's taught me a big kind of overarching lesson as well. Chronic illness symptoms like breathlessness aren't really going to be solved. So there's no magic bullet pill that's going to take it all away, but it doesn't mean that life can't go on or that it needs to close down. Other directions and possibilities can open out. What is required is an offering for those of us who are involved in these kinds of problems. An offering that enables people to see there are other directions. When that door closes, this one might open up. And that what we need to do is think not necessarily about what that intervention is going to lead to as an outcome, but what that intervention is like as an experience, as a relationship between us and the people doing it, as something which we're learning together It's something that people can take into their daily lives rather than just an outcome that will be reached and then it comes to an end. So I think what the project has done is offered people new ways of thinking, of speaking about their breath, and new ways of experiencing their lives in breathlessness. Thank you very much.